with a lot of things he said in his lifetime. He was dreadfully wrong with this part. The House, as I said, is more divided today than ever since 1865, probably. However, this House divided image is usually connected to, and it comes up regularly in political problem situations. And if we look at these political problem situations, we find that they're usually connected to an election, more often than not a presidential one. A. B. The Bible will get involved somehow and called in, like here. And third, the problem situation usually mirrors an internal division rather than a conflict that involves any external forces. And starting on this presupposition, I have identified a total of 7 situations. Here the about years, it's not just that 1 year, it's usually a number of years around the date. And these 7 I will have a brief look at. I hope it will be brief, or you will at least bear with me. There are some missing here, like for instance the nullification crisis of 1832-33, or Warren Harding's Ohio gang. Sort of every 100 years the United States get a president that's a complete moron. But that really was a problem that was solved with relative ease. So no, these 2 I did not take on the list. Likewise, I did not really include any of the wars fought with other countries. As I said, the crises that we look at are internals rather than externals. However, so none of the above make the cut. However, there are 2 Civil War formats, really. There's one where a political crisis situation results in actual threats against each other, protests, unrest, and eventually even armed conflict. That is, one side or the other or both starts resorting to physical violence. And then there's the second level, and that's the level of structural deficiencies, which result in undeclared civil wars. And those undeclared civil wars really last throughout, from the beginning of the United States in 1776 to the present day. These are undeclared civil wars against minorities, against the lower classes, and against the environment. And these are the 2 forms of civil war that I will look at, of which one is permanent, the other one comes in sort of horizontally, vertically at different times. First one, the War of Independence, 1774, which sounds like it's an external event, so a war between North America and the British motherland. However, if we look at the actual situation in the 1750s, you see here on this map, and I guess the map's again, technically speaking, there, is it? When we're projecting this? So, at the moment it's in behind me, but supposedly you can see the PowerPoint also, or rather the PDF, which I uploaded for your benefit, so it's there. This map here shows you the areas held by the French in green, or French, let's say, zone of influence rather than real occupation. Spanish is brown. The British colonies are divided into the 13 colonies, which then eventually rebelled and depart around the Hudson Bay in the north. By 1776, this had changed insofar as New France had been given up in the Treaty of Paris in 1763 after the 7 Years' War. So this is all British influence, but 13 colonies rebel and cut themselves loose off the British mother country. The rest stays British. And in fact, in a way, stays British to this day. The place is now called Canada. So there is an internal strife here, an internal conflict that's unresolved. Donald Trump offered to buy Greenland. He has not made an offer for Canada yet, and I don't expect this to happen within the next 3 weeks. But it's almost a bit surprising, given that on several occasions the United States made sort of lunges towards getting Canada under their control politically. Economically, they were more successful at it. But at the moment, Canada still looks as if it's staying an independent country. So why this independence movement in the 1750s, already 60s, then 70s? Of course, all of you, I guess, know the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events, blah, 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 and it's all the fault of the British king. There's a point to that. King George was not exactly a good king, but the independence movement had started earlier. The sales pitch was based on a variety of different sources, columns, one of them being the letters from American farmers stating that they were really a agricultural, natural country as opposed to the effete and sort of Baroque, superfluous, wealth accumulating English court. Joseph Schoep's article here, for those who want to dig deeper into it, is highly recommended. That was the sort of ideological basis. The more economic basis you can see here. The war, the 7 Years' War in particular, called the French and Indian War in North America, had been extremely costly. And the British Crown did not exactly like the idea of paying for all of this by themselves, particularly since American sources had been remarkably stingy about contributing anything to the effort. So taxes were raised, new taxes were installed, the so-called Stamp Act, by which you had to pay something for every official document and you got a stamp that showed you had paid, highly unpopular with the colonials. Then there's the question of political representation, insofar as these loyal British subjects in North America did not find themselves represented in the English Parliament. And as I already mentioned, King George was a particularly reactionary king who tried to turn the clock back on a number of developments, which made him unpopular even in England and even among his own peers, which then resulted in a certain reluctance to enter into the fight and to provide additional resources once the turn of the tide turned against the British forces in North America. However, this whole economic basis should not be overlooked. It's not so much American freedom fighters against British colonial oppressors. One indication as to what's behind it may be seen from Benjamin Franklin. There are less and less Trekkies among my students these days. Maybe the people from the Carl-Schurz-Haus who are seeing this are more sort of my generation and remember seeing that in the 1990s. If you pronounce Franklin in Japanese, you get Ferengi. And the Ferengi are this race out there in outer space who are following the Ferengi rules of acquisition, many of which sound suspiciously like Franklin's advices, Poor Richard's Almanac advices to a young merchantman. War is good for business, peace is good for business. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And so a penny saved is a penny earned, all of these things. So the economical concern that they're not making max profit out of their ventures is something that's definitely driving Americans into this independence thing. I already mentioned the no taxation without representation. And they even adopt Indian garb, an instance of indigenization, which is rare in American history, to dump tea into Boston Harbor. That had to do with the Stamp Act. Just as Patrick Henry's famous speech condemning the Stamp Act resolution in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Give me liberty or give me death. That's a pretty tall order. But then some of them were actually serious about it, and so we get the fighting in Lexington and Concord already in 1775, and from then on. That time in April, Thomas Paine doesn't know yet that he'll be the author of Common Sense by the end of the year, so he's still writing rather silly texts for the Pennsylvania magazine. But then he sides with the rebels and becomes a rabble-rouser. Zachman Berkovich, even, who is a liberal critic, says of Paine that his natural and intended audience is the American mob. It is not just that Paine appropriates the language of the people, he uses anger, the natural emotion of the mob, to let the most active groups find themselves in the general will of a Republican citizenry. So using language, using rhetoric to bring out the best and the worst in people, that's something that starts with the War of Independence as the Civil War that it was, because many Americans, of course, had strong ties to Britain. Most of the British military in North America had been recruited within the land, and they had to decide which side they were on when the Declaration of Independence came about in 1776. And those who lost eventually left the country. The Declaration itself is likewise an item, an example for political rhetoric using biblical form. I've said the Bible would be involved somehow. This litany, he did, he has. A deist sentiment, God is invoked, nature and nature's God. And there are fake news in the Declaration of Independence, like the hordes of officers that the British king supposedly sent to eat, coming upon the country like locusts, another biblical image, and eating out their substance. That was a total of 50 customs officers, which the British Crown sent to North America because the Americans were smuggling everything that had been nailed to the deck. So much for that. So the War of Independence, the question is really whose independence from whom? And you'll find that it's mostly the independence of the North American merchant class from British taxation. There is a division within the North American hegemonial bloc. So people going either way, and that to me is called a civil war. Yeah. Which results, I said that earlier, in the creation of the Dominion of Canada, and much to the surprise of the Americans, the French colonies, the French settlements that had just been incorporated into British North America in 1763, they go and stay with the British Crown. So the period of the War of Independence results in a new arrangement in North America, and it also rings in the end of the game for the Haudenosaunee. You may remember the map I showed at the beginning of this section. You can go back to it too and see there are some areas that are sort of unclaimed by either side. Those are the areas at the time held by and governed by the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, as they are also known. So to them, the War of Independence is a complete disaster because some of them go with the British, some of them side with the Americans, and American forces destroy their livelihood. No taxation without representation. There goes. Bill Clinton in 1992 knew what the independence had been all about when he created his election slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." As if it had ever been anything but the economy. The next political crisis, from bloody Kansas to the war between the states. The US Constitution provided that there would be slaves and that these slaves could not be liberated just so. In practice, there had been free states which granted that the slaves that had made it there would not be returned to their masters, and their people had invented all sorts of really ingenious devices in order to get out of slavery, like here in this cartoon, the famous Box Brown, as he was called, who had mailed himself into freedom in a box. Unfortunately, somebody who couldn't read had placed the box upside down. It clearly said up and down, but the box arrived with him having been hanging upside down for a while, but he made it. The fugitive slave law, however, insisted that even in those states that had already abandoned and abolished rather than abandoned slavery, escaped slaves could there be returned from. So they had to escape all the way to Canada if they wanted to remain free. A unbearable situation for those that had declared themselves abolitionists, and of course creating insecurity for those who were already in those free states, because even free-born African Americans could be abducted to the South. This happened in many cases, and sold back into slavery there. There were very few courts where the judges would decide in favor of an African American if there were white people to testify against them. So much for the American court system, which is another one of the problem points from the start, from the word go. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, even though not really meant to incite trouble, did exactly that. The political reaction to it, notably in the South, and then several dramatizations of this novel resulted in a lot of popularity for it. It was the most well-selling novel or book in US history, except for the Bible, in the 19th century. And it created a lot of resentment on the other side, which is here, or shall here be personified by the so-called fire eaters, John Calhoun, who had been President Jackson's vice president and an important figure in the nullification crisis, which was already, by the way, about states' rights, what rights do the individual states have, and can they, for instance, secede? The South is getting more and more into a mode in these 1850s where they start believing the stereotypes that are around about them, namely that there is a class of aristocratic planters and also yeoman farmers who are aspiring to nothing more than to become aristocratic planters, and all Southern women are belles. From personal experience, I can tell you that they're not. And all the darkies are loyal, and I suspect they weren't, at least many of them weren't. There are some interesting instances of what can be called loyalty after the war, but that would lead too far. Certainly not a loyal darky was this gentleman, Frederick Douglass, whose autobiography, written in and published in the 1840s, indicated definitely one thing. If an African American could do the things that Douglass had claimed he had done, and if he could write something like this without white assistance, and of course fake news said this had been written by a white person, then the whole idea that the African was not able to stand up intellectually and physically and in any respect to their white masters, and this was null and void. This was actually an unbearable situation. So some thought this was more unbearable than others. The famous John Brown is an example on the abolitionist side. There were similar people on the pro-slavery side, that is, people who would resort to murder of neighbors and even relatives over this whole issue and over the fight whether slavery was going to be extended into the new territories or not. The presidential elections of 1860 were probably the ones that were watched with a similar sense of urgency, a similar sense of doom as the ones that are coming up in 3 weeks. If the Democrat Party had not split between Stephen Douglas Democrats and the Southern Democrats that rallied around the later Confederate General John Breckinridge, they would have carried the day. And it's not as if the others were all rallying behind Abraham Lincoln. There was a party called Constitutional Union by the now forgotten John Bell. Carl-Schurz, for the Carl-Schurz members in the audience, is also involved here, a 48er revolutionist who had escaped to North America and who, as a political orator, throws his weight in with Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans. The German immigrants had traditionally leaned more towards the Democrat side, also because the Republicans and the Know-Nothing Party before them had been traditionally anti-immigrant, but Lincoln seemed to be the right man to Schurz, and so he won a lot of people and votes over to the Lincoln side. The result, Lincoln carries 18 states, Douglas 12, Breckinridge 11, and Bell 3. So there's actually a almost a majority against Lincoln, but the vote on the other side is split several ways, and in the end, Lincoln gets elected, upon which South Carolina secedes on December 10th, 1860. This is something I don't expect to happen in December of this year. I mean, there have been fantasies about California, Oregon, and Washington State separating from the rest by my late friend Ernest Kallenbach, but this is probably not going to happen. Besides, they're too busy fighting forest fires due to the climate overheating that's gripping the United States more and more. Back to this secession here. One thing that I am still marveling at is all these secessionists would have had to do is go to the Supreme Court, which by then was loaded against the anti-slavery groups and the union, let's say, well, maybe not the union, but they might have asked on which conditions a state could leave the union. And the Supreme Court would have come to some sort of decision. They didn't do that. They relied on their own propaganda. That's always a bad sign when you start believing your own propaganda. So they took over federal installations in South Carolina by military force. That's political piracy. That's something no democratic Republican nation state can suffer. And so Lincoln calls for a posse comitatus, armed forces, to accompany U.S. Marshals to go into the South and restore order. By this time, the White House isn't even fully built. So this is a half-finished building with a, well, the Capitol isn't finished yet, and a half-dissolved nation. The process of secession, the red states remain in the Union. The blue ones are border states that do not secede, or not legally at least. There are groups that declare secession in Maryland and in Missouri, but they are not representative. And then the deep south states in blue here secede until the fighting starts, and the other four afterwards. When South Carolina state troops start firing on Fort Sumter, South Carolina in April, that's it. And if you've ever asked yourself, why did the ones wear blue and the other ones gray? Yeah? Blue is the color of the Union Army. Gray is the color of the state militias. And that's in all the states. So in some of the first battles, some pro-Union forces actually came in their militia uniforms and ended up being shot at by these guys. And some pro-Confederate units decided that blue was a nice color, so they wore that and got shot at. It's pretty idiotic, like any war usually is. But that's how the blue and the gray comes about. I'd like to squeeze in a little bit again on German behalf. Can you see this flag here? Do you notice something unusual about it? Like the field that has usually the stars in it? That's black, red, and gold. That's a flag that was handed over to the 7th Regiment of New York Volunteers, an all-German regiment with a strong 48er revolutionist background. And here is Carl-Schurz, side by side with General August Willich, another 48er, in an album that we actually have in the holdings of the Carl-Schurz-Haus, given to us years back. The whole historiography of the Civil War, the real Civil War, the big Civil War, the one that everybody acknowledges was a Civil War, except those people who still talk about the war between the states or even the war of northern aggression. It's mostly a battles and leaders historiography. When you dig deeper and look behind the actual numbers, you notice that why was this war fought? It's the economy, stupid. Chattel slavery was a form of labor that had certain advantages to the owners, but it had also certain disadvantages. In fact, when after chattel slavery had ended in 1865, was abolished finally, by the late 1870s, the plantation owners had realized that now that they'd written off their losses, the sheer monetary value of the slaves, they could do a lot better with hiring people, often not having to pay them anyway, but hiring them as sharecroppers. So they would get a part of the harvest, from which was deducted, of course, the money that they'd advanced them for food, for medication, all things that they'd had to provide for their slaves, but not any longer for these people now. So, 720,000 people dead, more than 2 million injured, and the whole damage might have been avoided if it hadn't been for too many people believing their own propaganda and too many other people thinking they could make a nice profit out of the whole thing. The toll it took, the toll this war took, can also be seen in the face of this man. These are two photographs, 1860 and 1865. This is the same person, but from the looks of it, the man didn't sleep for one night during those 5 years. He is murdered in 1865, almost to the day 4 years after the war started. And unfortunately with him, the rhetoric of reconciliation dies. When in his second inaugural he had talked about how the war was coming to an end, this was definitely visible, and how with malice towards none, and with charity to all, they would now start going about the rebuilding of the nation. That didn't happen. Likewise, the second birth of freedom that he announced in the famous Gettysburg Address also didn't happen, or at least not in the form that he had envisaged. Instead, we get a post-war Union, resembled here by an image by Homer Winslow, the veteran in a new field, the Union soldier who is discarded or shed his jacket and his canteen. They are lying in the front right here, and has turned his back on that war and is now cutting wheat. On the one hand, and on the other hand, you get the Confederate veteran returning to his dilapidated home. Note that the guy still has his gun. There's a threat right here. The South will rise again. All of this stuff was still going on. The undeclared class war is also still going on. A lot of Union volunteer soldiers found that the mortgages that they had to take out on their farms when they entered the war effort had not been paid by anybody. And that a lot of farms were foreclosed on by larger conglomerates. The race war that had been going on before the war continued into it. A lot of African-American Union soldiers who had fallen into Confederate hands were murdered point blank by their captors. And after the war, the whites from both the Union and the former Confederate side were quite happy to let the African Americans sort of see to their what they did with their freedom anyway. They definitely did not get the 40 acres and a mule that Spike Lee famously adopted for his production company as a name in, I think, the 1990s. So the next years are riddled with interracial conflict, with economic conflicts between so-called carpetbaggers from the north trying to cash in on the defeat of the Confederates and reconstruction efforts on their parts. And when in 1876 the Americans would have loved to celebrate the centennial with things like the Philadelphia exhibition, which showed the largest engine in the world, the so-called coreless steam engine. Here's a picture of it. They found that this centennial was badly tarnished by the economic depression that had hit the US in 1873 and was still lasting. The efforts of the Ku Klux Klan, formed already in 1866 in the South and active to this day. An undeclared race war still going on in many cities in the South, including heavy fighting with hundreds of dead in South Carolina and notably in here in 1874 in New Orleans. And of course the defeat of General George A. Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn had thrown a damp towel over the celebrations on the 4th of July 1776, when in late June of that year he got himself wiped out with his regiment fighting against Lakota, Arapahoes, and Cheyenne in Montana. So, yeah, I mean, George Custer, this was an avoidable defeat too, but there are always these hair guys, you know, who deep inside are afraid of being complete failures and get themselves into enterprises that are just a few numbers too big for them, and then get themselves wiped out. And yeah, he did not have anybody to bail him out just in time. So the election that year results in a serious stalemate. Samuel Tilden, governor of New York, highly respected, a Democrat. Rutherford Hayes, governor of Ohio, so both of them from Union states, a Republican, and Tilden had promised that he would end Reconstruction, and Hayes in the end did it. This is the one case in US history where not only the majority of the votes had really gone to the guy who in the end had to actually defeat Tilden in this case, but also the number of votes in the electoral. So this compromise is really a result of an, again, rigged court system. They set up a commission. In this commission, there's one vote more for the Republican side than for the Democrats, and the Republicans simply declare victory for Hayes in the 4 states that are sort of wobbly. It's very clear that 2 of them must have gone, or should have gone to Tilden, and that would have tipped the scale towards him, but this is how it works. So Hayes' administration from the start is lopsided, and he does some good in terms of a civil service reform. Civil service until then had been largely something that came with political grabs, and so you put your political cronies into the offices that you wanted them in. Carl-Schurz tried to, he was the Minister of the Interior under Hayes, he tried to get a civil service reform going, which demanded at least a minimum of competence for the respective office that somebody would get into. He was also responsible for the reform of the reservation system and the indigenous population. The end of Reconstruction means the removal of federal forces of occupation from the formerly Confederate states, and in effect that means there's a complete reconstitution of the pre-war powers, the aristocratic planters. It also means that the war against, this is again sort of the horizontal bar, war, the undeclared class war against the lower classes will continue, notably in the so-called Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And for the first time, what we get is not just state guards, state national guards, and the US Army being deployed against striking workers, but a private militia. Pinkerton, Alan Pinkerton, had been Lincoln's chief of spies during the war. He had been singularly ineffective, but he had certainly made much of it afterwards and founded the Pinkerton Agency, which then provided scabs, so strike-breaking workers, for companies, and it provided the armed militia that would guard these workers against striking elements, striking workers. Why do I call this also a Civil War situation? Because, for instance, in this strike and later on in the Homestead Strike, both sides had armed militia forces deployed against each other. There were considerable losses on both sides, and even the use of cannon that were standing around on the Civil War battlefields and sometimes in city squares as monuments, but they were still in usable condition, apparently. And with that, the latest here, I'm supposed to have a break, a pause. Of course, you can have a break whenever you want. You just switch me off. And since today is not running, streaming isn't working. But, yeah. Okay, to make things worse, there's going to be a Wartungspause, or there is a Wartungspause on Ilias, so we can't even extend today's session. No, that's great. I'll speed up. I guess that's the only thing I can do here. 1891, anarchism. The anarchists are the overlooked conspiracy legend in American history. Even Michael Butter, who is currently being celebrated and called in to all sorts of talk shows, who did his habilitation with me on this book on conspiracy theories, he overlooked them. And I don't talk about conspiracy theories, I call them conspiracy legends. Theory has something to do with actual thinking, rationality, enlightenment, all that. which is what these conspiracies are not. There are three forms of anarchism, and they all share the distrust of state apparatuses. They are anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist, and they like direct action. That is, people will try to live as if the conditions they try to generate already exist, which is dangerous. Dangerous to the US economic system, dangerous to the US political system. A lot of people in the US that I know, and many of those who voted for Trump in 2016, I would call something like conservative anarchists. You know, they won't rely on the government. They are deeply distrustful of the state apparatus. They are very helpful when you ask them for anything. They will give you the shirt on their back, but they will take up arms, and they of course have arms, if somebody tells them that they have to give you a shirt. Know what I mean? So there is a strongly syndicalist impulse in this conservatism in the US, as long as it's conservatism and it doesn't come with the maintenance of privilege, which is reactionary. The anarchists, however, scare the bejesus out of the American establishment in the 1880s and 1890s, so they resort to conspiracy legends about them, just about anything but that they suck blood from little children, and they resort to judicial murders. Court system being rigged as it usually is in the US. This is what happens from the Haymarket 7 all the way to Joe Hill in 1915 and Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti in 1927. On the other side of the equation, we get President William McKinley being assassinated by a self-appointed Bakuninist anarchists. Bakunin wing thinks you have to destroy everything and then rebuild society from the bottom up on the ruins of the capitalist nation states. I hope that isn't true, but Leon Czolgosz thinks it anyway and kills, wounds McKinley. He dies 8 days later. Can't spend more time on this. 1968, again a crisis that culminates in 68, which has been called a turning point in American history when history failed to turn. This starts earlier, of course. This starts in the 1850s already, Brown versus Board of Education. The return of the Confederate battle flags adopted on state flags in the South. Now that's when these battle flags become the Confederate flag. The flag of the Confederacy had looked completely different. It's not just about voting rights. I mean, look at the banners these guys are carrying. Decent housing now, jobs now. No, it's the economy, stupid. In the 1960s again. And with the Civil War Centennial and the Civil War Centennial celebrations, the United States get rather close to another civil war. One of the potentially defusing moments, at least for one side of this equation, but one that aggravates the hatred on the other. Now, there are people that will just not bear it if people have more fun than they do. There's a Puritan principle. Now, the summer of love is beautiful, but only for some. And so reaction sets in, and there's the winter of our discontent, the assassinations in a relatively short period of Malcolm X, of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy, and then subsequently riots, destruction. I wouldn't call it warfare yet, but there are troops deployed into American cities to restore an order that is at best, and to this day, tentative. Democrat selection of a presidential candidate in August 1968 in Chicago erupts into complete mayhem. The mayor of Chicago, the famous Daley, who'd handed the state of Illinois to Kennedy in 1960, sends out his goons, his police forces. This is as close to Civil War conditions as you get in that year in 1968. And it makes the headlines for a short while, as long as the headlines are not taken by the other big outside war that is being fought in Vietnam. And normally images of Vietnam focus on cruelty and on the fighting. I chose these pictures here to remind you just briefly that the average age of the US soldier deployed in Vietnam was 19.2 years. And this counts all of the older officers and the general staff. And you can see from some of them that they were probably younger than that. Another, and they then returning provide another force for civil unrest to reckon with. The number of actually disturbed veterans seems to be higher than in the First and Second World Wars, but then that becomes a literary and sort of cultural trope too. The Black Panther Party, another Civil War element. Now, there was a Black Panther before the superhero movie from last year. The party founded by two rather sinister characters, at least Huey Newton. I just don't know. I guess I wouldn't have liked him. But anyway, it's an attempt to counteract police cruelty, police injustice, police aggression against African Americans in cities. So these armed citizen patrols, who just happen to be African American, observed police actions in the cities. There are a number of altercations, some people killed. From 1968 on, however, the Black Panther Party engages mostly in community social programs, setting up their own so-called liberation schools. There's a breakfast program for disadvantaged children, and this apparently was more of a danger to the establishment than these armed guys running around in the cities, which was mostly theatrical, in fact. So if you have the time, have a look at this letter here, which explains how the American Secret Services are supposed to go after an actress who was supportive of the Black Panthers. Defamation, disinformation, fake news campaigns, and in many cases also direct murder. The famous case, December 4th, 1969, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark get riddled with more than 100 bullets in Chicago, not firing one shot back. Edgar Hoover was it who said that the breakfast program was the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the Black Panther Party and destroy what it stands for. So that's what their aim was. Two more crises, we're getting there. Environment's last chance in the year 2000. This is the third of those horizontal bars that I'm talking about. I mean, the environment had never played a big role in American politics except that it was being taken out, cut down. Already in the 1930s, there are songs like this one about Muhlenberg County, Kentucky, which I know if you're thinking now about Hambacher Forst and so on, here a whole county disappeared because there was brown coal underneath it, and it's a son asking his father, could they get back home? Could they go back home at some point? and the father has to answer that this is actually impossible. So, Daddy, won't you take me back to Muhlenberg County, down by the green waters where paradise lay? What's the son? I'm sorry, my son, but you're too late in asking. Mr. Peabody's coal train has hauled it away. Well, the Peabody Mining Company responsible for that. In 1979, we knew almost as much about global overheating as we know now. The problem is that science and scientific research will never be 100% certain, and this is exactly the margin, the little margin of uncertainty that the enemies of the environment and the friends of the oil and coal and so on industries use, explaining that, well, you're not quite sure, are you? Huh? And whoever is an honest scientist will say, yes, there is a margin of disagreement, or there are some data that do not add up to 100%, but 95 should be good enough. No? So, one of the faces of people to remember as a representative of the oil industry, George Herbert Walker Bush was an oil millionaire, and he had been supported by the oil industry. So when the oil industry, after originally in the 1980s, in the early 80s, realizing what was happening, what was going on, but then they decided that short-term profit was actually the more convenient way, because it would be very difficult and would cost them money to do otherwise. And they hired John Sununu, who was the White House Chief of Staff. So the Noordwijk Climate Conference in 1989 did not result in what might have been done already back then, and a 20% reduction of carbon dioxide emissions by 2005, and we could be a lot further than that by now. Anti-environment legislation. How does that work? You get lobby groups to give money to buy politicians. It's as easy as that. And then you have a Supreme Court who will also go along with that and allow the plea by a group called Citizens United, which resulted in the so-called super PACs, unlimited sponsorship by the super PACs. Individuals, there's a limit for $5,000 if you want to support a politician. And Charles and David Koch are particularly bad at this, or good, depending on which side you're on. There are all these think tanks that they sponsor, and then see to it that, for instance, the Keystone XL pipeline, which Obama at least stopped, is set in motion again by Donald Trump. There are groups called Citizens for a Sound Economy, which then rename themselves Freedom Works, because that thing with the sound economy, it's the economy, stupid. It's just a bit too obvious, but Freedom Works sounds a lot more like 1776 and all that, and they were behind the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation for the Supreme Court. Christian Lammert, a political scientist at the FU Berlin, calls the super PACs shadow parties. So there's a lot more exchange between government parties and lobby groups. Already in the Obama days, there were more than 4,000 lobbyists in Washington that were officially accredited, and that doesn't count the others. The Koch brothers were not behind Trump originally. Now they are. The one behind Trump was this guy called Robert Mercer. He also sat on the Breitbart connection and placed Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway in the White House. Now that didn't quite work the way he wanted, but that's another story and would take too far here. Maybe we'll hear more about that from some of my colleagues in the next few weeks. Another group that shouldn't be overlooked is the so-called Fellowship Foundation, an extreme rightist evangelical group who declares that the free market is actually God's will, just in case God didn't know that. Now, it's the economy, God. They are behind the idea of trickle-down economics, which means enriching the rich. And their national prayer breakfasts have been visited by all presidents since Eisenhower. So much for anything called liberals in U.S. history. Don't forget that the party that's currently advocating Joe Biden for president is somewhere to the right of the German Christian Democrat Union, whereas the Republicans have sort of left the field as far as German equivalents are concerned. Not even the AfD is anywhere near what the Republicans are in the US. The closest I could get to would be Mussolini's Italy, and Mussolini is as close to Trump as it gets anyway. So the catastrophe in 2000 is that the Supreme Court decides the election and hoists George Bush the younger into the presidential office seat. We'd have to speculate on what would have happened if Gore had gotten into that job. But anyway, one thing I put in here a bit incongruently yesterday is that I read the most affluent top 1% of the world population are responsible for more than CO2 emissions than the bottom 50%. And this is maybe the time to look at some of those flawed equations that are still around. You know, we made the huge mistake also when the Eastern Bloc collapsed that there is such a thing as an equation of capitalism and democracy. That didn't work. The belief that market economy has anything to do with fairness, and then that there's a huge contradiction between the perception of nature as beautiful. No, nature isn't beautiful, nature is just there. The beauty of nature has a lot to do with the uninhabitability of big cities. Now that's not me, that's Bertolt Brecht who said that. And then natural resources are supposedly free and they're supposedly inexhaustible, both of which is untrue. The free may be for the companies that exploit them, but not if you look at the result of that exploitation. So by 2020, are we looking at just another civil war possibility or opportunity, or are we looking at more? And I'd say we're actually looking at more because there is an ingrained deep state plutocracy at work here. The United States have basically given up on the idea of democracy and democratic change over the last 50 to 100 years. The electoral system is dysfunctional. If Trump gets reelected, it will be the 5th time in U.S. history that the majority of the vote is not adequately represented in who is elected to the presidency because of an electoral system that's deeply flawed. The lobby influence on politics won't go away either. Whoever gets into the presidential office, the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance, is currently studded with lobbyists or people who were originally lobbyists for anti-environmental corporations. The political control of the court system won't go away either. And the lobby influence, even extending onto the education system, makes sure that American kids learn just the stuff that the corporations want them to learn and nothing else. The abuse of media, social media, local media, aggravated by the so-called fairness doctrine that was a huge mistake which was supposed to give adequate representation to both sides. What it means is that there's equal media coverage for all sorts of bullshit. And if a scientist says something based on data and years of work that can be held for the truth, there's always the danger that some idiot steps up and says, that's not true, and then that's equally covered by the media. Yeah. Does it switch off at the quarter to? 1 minute, brilliant. I'll jump the so-called Proud Boys. I'll jump the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. These will be the goons that will probably see to it that Trump stays in office, whatever the result of the election. I recommend this article here. Thomas Asheuer in the Zeit of last week. So the problem, we're back to the horizontal bar, is that there is and has always been business as usual. Peter Kropotkin calls this die Macht der Gewohnheit. And there's always a fearful and cowardly middle class. Actually, you can read that yourself. This accounts for why there's still 40% voting for Trump. This fear of losing privileges or the chance to attain privileges they don't have. I still remember that guy who told me he was pre-rich. There's a large segment hegemonial bloc aiming to keep the privileges they have, whatever cost to everybody else, including this democratic system, future generations.